We're starting to see now how all these different language technologies can be used to do some very dynamic and impressive things with web pages. CSS enables us to really mess with the different styles and positionings of elements in our web page. JavaScript allows us to make it all dynamic and responsive, and to change according to events over time. What we're going to see for the rest of this unit are technologies that allow us to engage these things more deeply, and allow us to do things that would take a lot of time and effort using the current languages. The first of these technologies, and the one that will really be threaded throughout the rest of this unit, is called jQuery. We're going to then take jQuery, once we've learned about it, and connect it up with all the other technologies that we've seen. CSS, Bootstrap, and some new ideas that we haven't explored yet. So here today, we're going to learn about what jQuery is. It's a term you might have even heard before. It's a very popular tool. Itself is just a jQuery, or it's a JavaScript library that provides a whole bunch of useful functions that make JavaScript easier to deal with. We'll get a little bit into the history of it, and then we'll just get into the basics of how jQuery works. After that, we're going to take a look at HTML forms in a lot more detail. We sort of got briefly introduced to those in the first unit, but we weren't able to do a whole lot because we didn't know JavaScript yet, and because we really need to know some helpful shortcuts that are provided by jQuery and HTML5 before we can go deeper into them. Now really is the time to do that, because once we learn how to combine that with Bootstrap, with HTML5 validation, and everything else, we can connect that up with jQuery and put it all together into a really big concrete example of how all these technologies can become one. So, before we delve into all of that, let's spend some time with this jQuery thing. jQuery has been around since 2006, and it was introduced as a library specifically intended to be wrapped around JavaScript in the browser. Now, it's designed to just make a lot of key tasks that you do all the time a lot easier. They talk about DOM element selection, so the document object, how you can easily sort of pull out different elements from it. Right now in JavaScript, we have to use a specific function that you've already seen, get element by ID. We also mentioned several other functions, get elements by class, get elements by tag name, and there's a bunch of other ones like that. But the one we most often use that is the most useful is get element by ID. And you'll find it's very limiting. jQuery is going to take that to a whole nother level. It also allows us to easily move around, go to parent nodes in the document object model, to move between siblings, and all sorts of other different positions within the document object model tree. Remember, it's a tree. It will also make things like event handling a lot easier, and do some really fancy things, including animation, which we aren't really going to look at, but you can have some fun with if you want to go look at the tutorials for that, and Ajax. Ajax itself is going to be the subject of the next unit. Suffice to say, it's a very powerful concept that jQuery makes a lot easier than if we were to do it by ourselves. In addition, one of the key elements of jQuery is that it shortens your JavaScript files. jQuery can do everything JavaScript can, and it almost always does it shorter, i.e. in fewer characters. This is important because it is actually code that has to be sent to the user in the form of a JavaScript file. And so if your file is shorter, then the code downloads faster. And in general, you'll also find it's just a lot less work on the part of the programmer, though a lot of that's mitigated by modern IDEs like Atom that will sort of autocomplete for you. I think you'll probably find that the jQuery way of addressing things is just generally cleaner and more consistent. Speaking of consistency, that is the other big thing that jQuery aims to provide. It provides you a consistent JavaScript interface, regardless of which browser the user is running the page on. So they might be visiting it from Windows, from OS X, from Linux, from their phone, and each of these will in turn have their own browsers that they prefer to support. And while there are some browsers that do run across all these environments, there is no single one that can account for every user. Each one of these has their own JavaScript engine. Each JavaScript engine behaves ever so slightly differently, despite the extensive use of standards. jQuery aims to normalize. It removes any instance where you have to think about what browser you're on and makes the response as uniform and easy to use as possible. That is perhaps, I think, its most important contribution, and one that's often overlooked. Browsers are getting better. And as time progresses, we find programmers like you and me don't have to deal with that as much. They're getting to where they respond in a fairly consistent way. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that it is perfect, or that every person who's going to access our web page is using the latest, greatest browsers. You should always consider that they might be coming from an older browser. And when you use something like jQuery, it'll just work. You won't have to think about supporting older browsers explicitly because jQuery has already thought about it for you. Let's talk about some of the key sort of nuts and bolts features that we're going to engage. We're going to go through each of these one by one and look at how it provides them. The biggest thing is something called the jQuery function. This is generally how we do everything that we're going to do with jQuery. And you'll see what we mean about this in a moment. It's a function that takes either a variable or a string in and gives us back either an element or some set of elements for us to mess with. It also has a whole bunch of other things attached to it, properties and functions that you can use to make life easier. You'll see that it supports CSS-like element selection. So remember when we learned CSS, we had to spend a lot of time learning the syntax of the selector part of a CSS rule. We'll look and see how all of that is actually supported by jQuery. So everything you do there, that flexibility, can now be brought over to JavaScript. It's going to give us back an element object, which we're used to when we do document.getElementById. But the one it gives back is in fact specialized. It's customized by jQuery. And it will provide us some features because of that are really important. And if we need to, we can still get the original JavaScript element if we want. It's going to give us all sorts of shortcuts. This is primarily how it makes its code shorter for doing the most common of tasks. And we'll go through all of these that I have listed here. And then lastly, it's going to let us play with the DOM tree. It allows us to add elements, remove them. It'll also allow us to find elements. And we'll see little examples of how we do all of that. So to begin with, what is the jQuery function? Well, in fact, it is a function named jQuery with a capital Q. And this is something, if you have actually dug into web page codes in JavaScript, you may have, in fact, never seen before, because the jQuery function has two names. It can either be this, jQuery spelled out with a capital Q, or it can be this, the single $sign character. This might seem odd. In fact, when we talked about the different variable names that are allowed in JavaScript, I sort of failed to mention the $sign character, and that's not entirely an accident. I don't bring it up because this is a character that's supported in variables despite the fact that it flies in the face of most C-based variable naming conventions. Normally the $sign is not something you can use in variable names. JavaScript allows it because it is a scripting language, and it's aiming to emulate several other languages that use the $sign variable in very specific ways. Very often you'll find there are languages that require you to put a $sign on the front of every variable name. You'll also find there's lots of scripting languages that allow you to use $sign in special ways. Languages like PHP and Python and Perl is another good example of one that makes use of the $sign in special ways. Consequently, you can actually name variables with a $sign in them. It can be the very first character if you want. And because of that, you can have a variable named just $sign. This is one of the shortest names that isn't likely to conflict with anything else that exists in the global namespace. If you were to name it with any other character, like underline or any letter, and you can't name it just a number because those variables can't start with numbers, a single character variable name of any other kind that isn't $sign may very well conflict with something the user wants to use. $sign, though, being such an unusual character for variable names, doesn't. And so there's this habit of most libraries exposing everything that they offer through this one character. It means that it's short. It doesn't have a verbose name, but it has a name that's easy to get to. And everything that we want to do with jQuery will be done off of this. Now, in modern days, usually when you write your code, you then put it through something called an obfuscator or a minimizer that rearranges all of the variable names so that they no longer have human readable names. And the point of this is usually to minimize the code so that there's as little of it as possible. And when you do that, the idea of using a real short name like this is actually not all that useful anymore. So modern practice has people using this name and then putting their code through a minimizer that will reduce the name down to something completely different. We're just dealing with code that works directly in the browser that isn't going to be minimized, so we'll use the $sign. But you might run into newer ones that bother to use the full spelled out jQuery, just so that they have their variable name means something and people can read it easier. In this class, expect the $sign to show up everywhere, and whenever you see it, you can be guaranteed it's jQuery. There are a few other libraries that also use the $sign to do what they do that are not fully compatible with jQuery, and they have to watch out for one another. We're not going to delve into any of those. The $sign means jQuery in our class. Now, what can we do? Well, the first thing you can do with this is you can pass in a string, and that string can contain any CSS selector. Now, you remember what some of those looked like. You can put a hashtag and an ID, and then it will select anything that has that ID, which will be just one element. You can put a period and then a class name. You can put a tag name without anything on the front, and it'll select everything that matches that tag. You can put all sorts of things here, and you've seen a lot of them before. All of this will look just like what you do in a CSS file or in a style tag. You can also nest these. You'd be able to put multiple ones and say, give me everything with the ID my class element, and then you could put my element ID, and then you could put my element class, and it will match things that are children of my element ID that have the class my element class. All of this is allowed inside here. And so that flexibility and power that we have to select things with CSS now becomes available in JavaScript. This is a really big deal. So keep all of this in mind. There's just one really important thing that you need to know about it. When you call this function, it isn't just going to return the traditional JavaScript element that you're used to. In fact, it's going to return a customized element object. It's usually called the jQuery object. The most important thing you need to know about this object is it doesn't necessarily represent a single element. Of course, if you call it with an ID, then it is guaranteed to be only one element. But if you call it with a class, it might actually be a set of elements. Or with something like this, where we're saying an attribute equals something. Or if you call it with a tag name, almost guaranteed it isn't going to be a single element. So you have to be careful. When we had functions available in JavaScript that would occasionally return us multiple elements. We haven't really used them at all. Get elements by class or get elements by tag name are both available. If we were to use those, they would actually return an array of elements rather than just a single element, and you'd have to single one out before you could do anything to it. We'll see that jQuery actually eschews all of that and makes it a lot easier to think about all of these, to think about what's returned by these things as just the same thing every time. It isn't an array sometimes and an element other times. It's just always a jQuery object. Now, what is the jQuery object? So this is essentially a special type of element. It's always the same. It doesn't matter if it was a table tag or if it was an image tag or some other thing that you selected. If you selected a whole bunch of tags rather than just one, what you get back is always the same thing. It will provide the same functions and properties no matter what you selected. This is important. If you got back a set of elements from it, let's say you selected things by class, and you go to change their inner HTML, you're going to change it for all of those tags at once. This might be surprising because, of course, that never happened before, but it's actually really powerful once you get used to it. You can select a bunch of things and edit or modify them all at once without having to worry about pulling them out individually or creating some sort of loop to access all the individual children or something like that. Now, you'll also find that some of the things we've been using so far that were custom properties of tags are not there. Remember, we did a bunch of that with table. You can get its header and its body, and then you can call things like insert row and create cell. None of these things are going to be available in the jQuery tag because they just create confusion. You have to know specifically that you have one of those elements to use them. And if you try to use them on ones that don't have those elements, well, you're going to get some strange results. So that's not provided here. We'll see, though, that it's pretty easy to work around those things. Most of those special attributes that are provided can still be gotten to through some special things that are available in the jQuery object. And if you're creative about it, almost all of them can be avoided without much effort. The key thing here is that it's all consistent. You don't have to think about which tag you're getting. You don't have to think about whether you're getting an array of objects or a single object. By and large, you just do the things you'd want to do, and it works. Another thing that's nice is that everything is a function. In the past, some things were properties that you assigned to, some things were functions that you called, and you always had to know the difference between the two and exactly how they worked. Here, you're going to find everything's a function and that they all more or less work exactly the same way. So it just makes it much easier to work quickly because you don't have to constantly be looking up exactly how the thing you're working in is doing. And you don't have to invest a whole lot of energy in memorizing all of the gory details. You memorize the model of how things work in jQuery, and it'll always work that way. Do keep in mind, with that simplicity comes the limitation that you can't quite do everything you did before with a jQuery object. But as I mentioned, if you do really need to get to the JavaScript object, it's really easy to reduce back down to that. Now, let's take a look at what this looks like. Here's some actual code. So as I pointed out before, here's the jQuery function being used. That's the $, and we're giving it an ID. It was saying select everything that has the ID my ID, and it knows it's an ID because we put the hashtag on the front, just like in CSS. What you get back from this is going to be a jQuery element. The jQuery object specifically is what they call it. Once you've got this, it's really easy to get the original object. Even if this was an array of objects, all you have to do is say .get 0. If it's just one object, then you'll get the DOM element that you're used to from JavaScript. If it was an array of objects, you'll get the DOM element for the first one. And if there were more than one, you could select them using a different number here other than 0. So it's really easy to have both your jQuery element and your old element side by side if you need to work with them. Now, let's see what we can do with this jQuery element. The key thing it's going to do is provide us a whole bunch of shortcuts to do things that we did previously with the DOM element a little bit easier. The first two of these I always like to talk about are the functions HTML and text. As we go through these, I'm going to try and show side by side what they look like in the old JavaScript approach and then in the new jQuery approach. So first, here's what we would do to set the contents of a tag. If we have a particular tag here and we want to set the HTML that's inside that tag, we say .inner HTML, and then we give it either some text or some HTML. In jQuery, it's going to look like this. Use your jQuery object and you say .html as a function. And generally speaking, everything that we do to a jQuery element is going to be done as a function instead of as a property like this. If I do .html as a function and pass it in something new, it does exactly what this first line did. It sets that as the inner HTML on that object. If I were to do .html without anything between it, then it returns the current inner HTML from that object, which is something that you could do with this one too. We never did it, but if you do .inner HTML on an object and set it equal to something else, that reads the value rather than writing to it. So this function behaves the same way as that original bit. Let's take a look now at what we would do to set something that is truly text inside of it. We actually did see this, though rarely do you have to do this. If it is text, you can still set it as inner HTML and it'll work. But if you want to make certain it's interpreted as text and not HTML, you actually have to do a two-step process. You do document.createTextNode, give it the text, and then you append that as a child to the element. So there's two steps in that. This ensures that it won't try and interpret it as HTML. And this would be slightly more efficient than if you set text to inner HTML. jQuery makes this super simple. It has a function, text, that works almost exactly like HTML, except it doesn't interpret it as HTML. It leaves it alone and just sets it as the content in the middle. And you can be sure that it's basically doing the same as these two lines, only it does it in a very small amount of code, which is, you'll see time and time again, that's generally a theme of how jQuery works. So this is the basic sort of getting text and HTML into an element. Let's see about styling it. So of course we're going to do that with CSS, and you may remember there is this object off of an element called .style, and that object has all these properties that are related to CSS properties, which you can set equal to the same values you would set them to in CSS code. So for an example here, we say style.border. We would set border equal to the same value that we would normally put for border in CSS. Now, jQuery allows us to do this in a slightly more CSS-like way. It doesn't save you a whole lot of characters. But again, it does it as a function, because everything that we're going to do with elements off of jQuery is a function, and allows you to specify first as a string the attribute and then its value. The nice thing about this is that up here, when you specify it as a property, the names have to change. And so things that previously were something like text-align would have to be changed to text-A align with no dash in them. Down here, when you do it with the .css function in jQuery, you don't have to worry about any of that. You just put in the exact attribute you'd put in for CSS, and incidentally, you can also do the attribute you would use for JavaScript if you wanted to. It will accept either. And then give it the exact value as a string that you would use in CSS. So it simplifies things. You don't have to think about any differences. You basically take what was attribute : value before and just put it in here first as an attribute, then comma, then the value in a string. So it makes things easier. This particular function also is really useful because it plays nicer with all the other styles that have already been assigned. It will give you a modification of the final computed style. And that style can be inherited from a bunch of different things. Maybe it came from a class that we applied using Bootstrap. Maybe it came from a previous class that you created programmatically using JavaScript. Or maybe it was some custom CSS you provided right in line in the tag. It can always get a little bit tricky and mean that when you assign it like this, you can't always be sure you're going to get the right final computed result. We've never run into that problem. Ours have never been complex enough for it, but it does get to be a problem when you delve really deeply into CSS. This jQuery one tends to avoid all of those pitfalls because it knows to go look for the final computed CSS style and to modify it rather than one that might be directly assigned to the object. Now, sometimes there are attributes that are custom. Let's assume that DOM element is an anchor tag. It will probably have an href attribute, as all anchor tags should. And if you were modifying that in JavaScript, you could just say .href and set it equal to some value, like example.com. An actual URL would be better here, but that's just sort of a placeholder. Now, in JavaScript, this would be perfectly fine because the element you get back always contains custom properties that are related to the specific element you asked for, like an anchor. In jQuery, that's not the case. Because not every element provides href, it's not something that's available. You can't just say .href and assign to it. Instead, because this is a custom attribute, you would need to write to it using the .attr function, like we have here. So on the jQuery object, we have a function attr, and this is for all other attributes that it doesn't provide for. You tell it what the attribute is, and then you say the value you want to set it to. It's a small price to pay for the simplicity of not having to think about all of the different tags and their different attributes. So you'll notice that this one's actually longer. This is one of the rare cases where jQuery gets to be a little bit more verbose than in traditional JavaScript. But most of the time, that is not the case. Here's another example. Let's say you were trying to modify the alt property or the alt attribute of what is probably an image tag, right? Again, you'd have to write out jQObject.attr, tell it it's alt you want to modify, and then give it the new value. And it's slightly longer than the traditional JavaScript approach. So keep that in mind. This really isn't a blow against JavaScript against jQuery, because jQuery has been really careful about only doing this when it is a very seldom accessed attribute. They've studied a lot of the coding habits in JavaScript, and they know which attributes are most commonly going to be modified in JavaScript. Some of them you just never touch in JavaScript. In fact, these are a couple of good examples. hrefs and alts, you're not changing those dynamically very often. They usually get set in the HTML and never messed with inside of the JavaScript. And so consequently, you very rarely need to do this. Let's look at classes. I don't think we've ever programmatically talked about changing classes on objects, or rather on elements, and that's because it's a little bit complicated. The most modern way of doing it is to use something called the class list. And so when you have an element, you can say .ClassList, and then this list has functions like add, toggle, remove, that'll allow you to sort of query which classes are assigned to this element. Now, in fact, this is a more modern JavaScript standard and one that isn't available on older browsers. On older browsers, you have to use something called class N name instead, and it's just a string, and it's really difficult to add to it or remove from it. So when that happens, you have to be sure and it's much more complicated to splice in new classes or remove old ones. Most modern browsers do support class list, but as I mentioned before, you want to support older browsers because you'll reach more people when you do. Now, how does jQuery approach this? Well, jQuery has a function. It's called addClass, and you give it one or more classes, and it adds them to the class list. And again, it's not any more powerful than this sort of modern approach right here, but it's shorter. And that's almost always what jQuery is going to do. Similarly, you can remove, class list.remove, and then you give it the ones you want to remove. jQuery, just like with add, provides a remove classes function to help you do that ever so slightly shorter. The class list also provides a toggle function that will allow you to toggle one or more classes as being either present or absent. So you can imagine toggling here is really when you just take something and you either add it or remove it. If it's there, you remove it. If it's not there, you add it. And so when you do that, like let's say it's the hidden class, you would be able to just toggle it on or off. jQuery naturally provides toggle class. And again, it can do it ever so slightly shorter than the other one. The last one you might occasionally want to do is you might want to search through an object to see if it has certain classes on it already. Class list has a contains function to find that. So you can say .contains my class, and it will return either true or false. jQuery has class, where you can test for one of these. Now, pay attention to all of those. Add class, remove class, toggle class, and has class. They're actually going to come in really handy this section because now that we have a really easy way to deal with them from jQuery, we're going to put them to good use. Think about all the classes that we like to work with when we have a library like Bootstrap. Now that we have these functions, we can actually insert those dynamically or remove them when we don't want them. That's going to make our whole web page a little more responsive. So this allows us to do some cool things. So remember these functions. Add class and remove class in particular, we're going to make use of. So those are all the sort of shortcuts that they provide. But there's other ways that jQuery sort of makes dealing with things a little easier, specifically with the DOM in general. So here we're talking about the entire tree that is the document, rather than just individual elements. For this, we have a couple different things that we tend to do from time to time. First would be appending. We've actually done this before with JavaScript. It's a little bit verbose. You have this function, document.createElement, and you pass it the name of the tag you want to create. This should be a lowercase d, I think. PowerPoint capitalized that for me, so it should be lowercase d document. When you run that, it returns back a variable that you can then attach to something that's already in your particular web page. We've used this when creating tables, which is why I show it with a TR. So you would then usually say, here's the same sort of process shown in jQuery. It's actually really simple. You use the jQuery function and you provide it the tag. So here I use the angle braces and provide it the exact tag name. And so when it sees that, instead of trying to select something, it creates it. Let me back up here. And it creates a new one, just like create element, and gives it back to you as a particular variable again that you can store. So here's the child element. Here is the jQuery child element I'm calling jchild. If you then want to add that to the DOM, well, you have to have the element already selected, and then you would say dot append child and give it the child you'd created. And presumably between these two lines, you might do some other things like set some classes on it, or maybe put some content in it or something like that. Again, we did all that with tables when we saw that example. How do we do that with jQuery? Well, you'll have the object somewhere, just like we have here, and you would just say dot append and give it the element. So it's very similar, but boy is it shorter. It's much simpler to work with. You use this same function you've always used, and this time you just give it the actual text of the tag. Now this might look like we're putting HTML in the middle of our JavaScript, and well, if you're really picky, we are, but it's just actually just something to signal it that I want to make a TR tag rather than select currently existing TR tags. If you didn't put these angle braces on there, that's exactly what it would do. It would give you back an array containing all the existing TR tags and an empty one if there were none. So instead we put the angle braces on there just so it knows we want to make one. So we could append that to our object here. Prepending is really difficult in JavaScript. We never tried to do that because it's so difficult. So prepending would be the idea of putting it at the front of the children list instead of at the end of the children list. Here's what you'd have to do. There's a function called insert before, which you would call on the object itself. You give it the thing you want to insert, and then you give it the element it should come before. And so this is what it looks like. Instead of append child, you'd say DOM element dot insert before, give it the child, and then you'd say DOM element dot child nodes 0, because that basically says insert it before the very first element. In jQuery, there's a function for it. We just say prepend, we give it the jQuery element, it works. Let's consider the task of trying to find an element relative to our current one. If we'd like to look through all the children of this particular element that has the ID, my ID, and try and find a particular one. This is actually something that's a little difficult to do in JavaScript. Again, we've never really talked about it before because it hasn't been a task we've needed to do yet, but you can do it. And here's what it would look like. This element, you can actually call the function getElementById, or all those other ones we've talked about, right on an element. We did it before on document, but you can do it on an element as well. And so it would then look through all of its children and find one that matches their criteria. So you'd be able to call those functions. With jQuery, there's an actual function, find. And the function find is going to take as its parameter any CSS selector. However, it's not going to select on the whole page. It's only going to select amongst the children of the current object. So this gives us the same kind of flexibility over the getElement functions that we had available that we saw when we were just selecting in general with the jQuery function. So let's give some examples here. There's a function getElements with an S by class. You give it a class, it returns back an array. You would then have to mess with that array, make sure you got the one you wanted, pull off the one you want to work with, and then you'd be able to do things to that specific child. So this will find children of DOM element that have this class on them, and you'd then be able to find the one you're looking for. In jQuery, we could do jQObject.find my class. Because we put the dot on the front, it knows we're talking about classes, and it'll find all children that match that. But it returns them, again, as a jQuery object. We don't have to actually go into the array, find one to do what we want to do. We can do the same things to it, and it will do it to all of them if there's many of them, or if there actually is only one, just the one. And so we don't have to think about doing anything differently. We get what we want, and then we can then immediately start working on it. Here's some other examples. Let's say you want to get all div tags that are children of the element. You do getElements by tag name, div, and that'll get all the divs as an array, and you would then have to go through and use loops or something to do things to all of them. jQuery, you take the jQuery object, .find div, and then you can immediately do .html or .text or .anything we looked at up to now, .css if you wanted to change the style of all those div tags. Really quick and easy. Here's another one. Let's say what you want to do is find all of them that have an attribute equal to some value. You saw how we did that when we were looking at CSS examples before. Well, there isn't actually any real easy way to do that in the standard JavaScript approach, which is why I put question marks here. You could do it. I'm not saying you can't, but it would take more than a single function. You'd have to basically go through all the children and examine their attributes manually to find it. You'd have to write this function yourself. In jQuery, you just pass it as a CSS selector. It does the work for you. You get back only those bits and pieces. So there's a lot we went through here. Then this is really just the basics of jQuery. We haven't delved into any of its sort of special features yet, or more advanced functionality. This just shows us how to do things like select elements out of the DOM, how to customize, or how those elements that we get back are this special custom jQuery object, which is a little bit different, all the different shortcuts that it provides, and then how we can manipulate the DOM.